Greetings and salutations, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well today. Today I have some terrifying encounters to share with you. Before we get into these terrifying encounters, though, I have a couple links I'd like to share as well. As you know, I rely on my Patreon, my PayPal, and my merch to help the channel to continue to grow and go. Those links are in the description below. Also, Dogman, Frightening Encounters, Volume 1, 2, and 3, the audiobook version, written by Tom Lyons, narrated and produced by me, Jeffrey Nadolny, is available on Audible, Amazon, and iTunes. The links to those books are in the description as well. Now, I've taken enough of your time. Let's get on with today's upload. Shall we? Today's first encounter. This encounter took place near Malcop Castle in Staffordshire, United Kingdom, in the autumn of 2014. I went out to some local fields one night to shoot rabbit, as I have done many times before. On this night, I had my pellet gun with me with a night scope attachment. Though I found it weird, I couldn't see a single rabbit around. It was a crystal clear night, and in the past I had expected to see a few about the area. I automatically assumed there must have been a fox in the area, so using my scope I scouted the area surrounding me. As I looked past a hedgerow, I saw what I can only call a pair of red eyes looking back at me. I lowered my scope for a second just to make sure it wasn't my eyes, and then looked straight back through them again, unaware of what I was going to see. There was something there, something that had stood up, standing upright at the hedge, but just a bit above it, looking right at me. I did notice a canine-like snout on the creature. I kept looking at it, wondering what this creature was. Then I watched this thing, whatever it was, go down on all fours, knowing now that originally this thing was on its hind legs. I saw the creature run off on all fours across the field at a steady pace towards an old mine. This was no regular dog, horse, or cow. In fact, I have no idea what it is. This witness has 2 adult daughters who confirmed that he had came home much earlier than he attended, really shook up and scared. He said he wasn't going to stay down there, especially when all he had was a pellet gun. To this day, he hasn't been back to that location since. He won't go out shooting alone at night anymore. This experience has really scared him to his core. Today's second encounter. This encounter happened to my aunt and uncle around the early 90s in a desert town of Yucca Valley, California. They had given me full consent to relay their Yucca Man encounter. My Aunt Deborah and Uncle Tom were driving home around dusk, while at a stop sign a block away from where they lived at the time, 2 enormous hairy creatures crossed right in front of their truck. They both walked in perfect sync and unison with each other. My aunt said you could feel the earth shake with every step they took, which were more like stomps instead of steps. When they got in front of her truck, they both turned their heads at them, also in perfect sequence with each other, stared briefly, then turned their heads back forward and kept marching on into the desert. This is where the border between a suburban neighborhood and the desert wilderness with nothing but dirt road exists. Another detail to add is that there were a pack of stray dogs that accompanied them, as if they were posing as the alpha dogs to a makeshift wolf pack, which adds another bizarre twist to what's already unbelievable. Also, another big detail in the description is that they had human faces and walked on 4 legs. My uncle said that he was afraid that these things would very well foot the car over effortlessly, considering their size and tremor-creating abilities. I've been fascinated with her experience ever since she relayed it to me. Years later, I've done some digging, and the only other sightings of these things is in 1800s, a prospector named Turner Helm in Warner Springs mentioned a bear-like creature with a human face. Back in 1971, the early part of the year, the Marine base there in 29 Palms, California, had an unusual happening. The man was in charge of the armory, and the night guard Marine was found at the rifle range one morning, almost incoherent, his rifle bent almost in two, and he described what was called the Yucca man. The creature was in the dark, and the guard had felt or heard a noise or something in the darkened desert. Upon raising his rifle and yelling out, "Halt!" this thing came at him, taking the rifle away and bending it almost in two. An investigation of the area and the guard's description was that of a Yeti. From what people can remember, the CIA and FBI were called in. Many dark suits were roaming around the area looking for info. Officials were called in, and the neighborhood in 29 Palms near the base was found to have two Yucca men seen that same night. One quite large, and a smaller one with it. At the corner of Valley Vista Street and Utah Trail, the resident dogs were barking, and people looked out the window to see the creatures. Johnny and Ray saw these yuccas and reported them to the officials making the investigation at the time. Johnny has since passed, but his wife Ray and daughter still live in the area. Further down the same road later on, the creatures were observed near a horse corral, where the horses were panicked. Early in 71, other sightings were in the Joshua Tree National Monument, now called a park, and the people sighting them were part of the monument employees. 8 years later, in May of 1979, a young couple were leaving their condominium complex in Desert Hot Springs, north of Palm Springs, when a large, hairy creature emerged from behind a yucca in front of their car. According to the driver, the animal, which had a chest the size of a refrigerator and arms that hung below his knees, was so large that he could only see it from the midsection down. The beast that reportedly was covered in long, tan-colored hair disappeared quickly back into the night, leaving no footprint evidence. Also in 79, a 12-foot-tall Bigfoot made a visit to Hemet, California, some distance to the south of Palm Springs, twice in a period of a week. This time, however, the creature left a grand total of 17 tracks in the mud along a rural road during its initial visit. These tracks measured 18 inches in length and were spaced some 6 feet apart. Noted Bigfoot researcher Douglas Trapp and Danny Perez both conducted an investigation of the sighting, even going as far as to perform a stakeout on the location where the tracks were found. But alas, the monster did not return. In 1988, a couple of servicemen from 29 Palms were returning home from a day of fun in the sun at Big Bear Lake at about 9 p.m. when they encountered a creature that the locals called a cement monster due to the fact that it's said to live near an old cement factory in Lucerne Valley. As the two men approached the old factory, a large upright running creature moved across the road in front of their car. As was the case 9 years earlier in the Desert Hot Springs, the animal in question was so large the men could only see its lower half. In disbelief, the two men just looked at each other for a moment before one of them explained, "What in the hell is that?" The other replied, "That's the cement monster. After him." The driver hit the brakes while the other reached for a gun that was in the glove box. The two adrenaline-filled men searched up and down the road and around the cement factory, but never found a sign of the creature. The pair came to the conclusion that they had seen some form of prehistoric man and returned to their journey home. One later account I thought I would share. Over the Easter break, in about 98, 99, I was camping, rock climbing at Joshua Tree with two friends. We stayed in the Hiddy Valley campground. At some point during the trip, I took a picture of our campsite, which backed against large rocks with the famous climb overhead. Between the rocks was a deep crevasse, though not a full cave, you guessed it. When the pictures were returned to me, there was a primate-type face peering out of the darkness of the crevasse. It wasn't super clear, but distinct enough that everyone I showed it to noticed it. I showed it to a friend who used to be a ranger at the Joshua Tree, and she thought that might be the Yucca Man, which was the first time I ever heard of it. I'm not certain where the photo is now, although I am certain I did not throw it away. Today's third encounter. I'm writing this for a friend who now wears a bulletproof vest and carries a gun every day because of this encounter. He said that there are 8-foot-tall creatures resembling reptilian-type beings surrounding his house at night. They get into his head and communicate strange things like stuff about the end of civilization, and that only a small group will survive. Sometimes they get physical, and then there's a loss of consciousness. They mimic his voice when he yells out into the woods at them. It starts off sounding strange, and they repeat it over and over until they get it right, exactly duplicated, until it gives them the chills and goosebumps. He shoots at them, and then a light smacks the bullets out of the air. When the light hits the bullets, it makes a loud snapping noise. He finds the bullets in the yard in the morning. Some bullets are perfectly shaped, and some are flat, like they have been run over by a train on a track. Since guns and bullets don't work, he's tried using a knife. He was able to stab one, and it yelled out. He used a bear trap once. It snapped shut, and the thing screamed. The trap was gone in the morning. There is so much to this story that I don't know if I can remember, but he wants some help. They don't seem to be able to come into the house for some reason. Humans might be working with them as well. At this same time that these incidents are taking place, someone shot his dog. The dog was placed in a box and left on his front door of his house with a note that said, "Do not forget." It sounds sort of like the Mothman prophecy stuff to me. Strange. The only way he sees himself actually being able to kill one of these creatures is by stabbing it while it's dragging you away, and hopefully it bleeds out before it takes you to where it wants to go. There is so much more to this story that only he knows and is willing to tell. He just wants to find out how to get rid of these creatures and get them out of his woods. Today's fourth encounter. When the following occurred, I was a new deputy for the sheriff's department, recently hired and straight out of the police academy. The county I worked in back then was a rural county, mostly farmland around with occasional livestock. I don't want to give away the exact location, but it was located in a state along the eastern seaboard. Being that I was new, I was given the third shift of patrol. That meant I worked from late evening until early morning. My area of patrol was pretty large, spanning most of the southern part of the county, which meant I had an area to respond to that was about 100 square miles. I know it seems like a lot, but the county was rural, with relatively small population. The particular night in question happened in springtime. It was cool, mid-early morning, and a fog had set in. I got a call from dispatch about a woman who said someone was at her residence. There wasn't much beyond that. The call in question was about a 15-minute drive. Not hesitating, I sped over. When I arrived, I found the house sat down a long gravel drive that stretched about 2/10 of a mile. At the end of the drive was an older 2-story home. Through the thick fog, I could see fields on either side, but not much else past that. I was alert and keeping an eye out for anyone who might be around, but saw no one, nor did I spot any suspicious vehicles. I had a light on the outside of my cruiser, and I turned it on and scanned the area, but the fog was making it difficult to see much. I finally made my way to the house and parked. With my flashlight in hand, I exited my cruiser and headed to the closest door, which was the side door. Before I could knock, I heard the deadbolt turn and the door flew open. Standing before me was an older woman, about 60 to 70 years old. She was draped in a tattered robe, and on her feet were slippers. Her gray hair was pulled back tight, and by the look on her face, she appeared petrified. I opened my mouth to ask about the call, and she interrupted me. She told me that something was just at the house and banging on her window. She said that it just left the second I pulled up. Upon hearing this, I headed to the spot, but didn't find a thing. I flashed my light around, but the fog made it impossible. I did a good search of the property, but found nothing, nor any clues. I returned to the side door to find her standing where I left her. I asked her to give me a detailed account, and this is what she told me. I was preparing to go to bed when I heard this loud slap on the side of my house. At first, I didn't think much of it. A second, and a louder, slap followed. I got scared and went to my bedroom to get my shotgun. From there, I made sure all the doors were locked. As I headed to the kitchen, I saw something move in the window over the sink. I rushed to the window to look out, but saw nothing but darkness. A loud slap came from the spare bedroom. I hurried through the house, shotgun in hand. When I turned on the lights in the room, I saw movement in the south-facing window, but couldn't make out what it was. That was when I got scared and called 911. These slaps have been occurring until you arrived. I asked her if she knew who it might be. Was it a neighbor? Was someone she knew not happy with her, or could it be a prank? She replied both. No. I could see that she was terrified. I took a full report and assured her that whoever it was, they were gone now. The hour was getting early. As I could see it was getting light outside, I said my goodbyes and headed to the cruiser. Outside, the fog had lifted. Just as I was about to get in, her door opened. She shouted, "It's in the field!" She pointed to my right. I looked and saw something tall and dark standing on two legs about 200 yards away. I rushed to the fence and shouted. It turned and sprinted off to a figure of the woods close by. I raced back to my cruiser, started it and sped off. I figured that I could catch whoever it was if I drove. The figure of the woods connected to the county road. I sped down the driveway, turned left, and headed about the area it would be in, when something massive ran out in front of me. I slammed my brakes, looked at what I can only call a big, hairy, man-type creature. It was tall, long arms. Its face looked like a man's, but covered in darkish-colored hair. In what must have been 2 steps, it cleared the county road and went into the woods. I wasn't sure what I had just seen. I hopped out of my car. I had my lights on, my flashlight in hand, scanned the woods, but didn't see anything. I was tempted to go pursue on foot, but something in my guts told me not to. That, what I'd be going after, was not a person, but something else. I got back into the comfort and security of my cruiser, picked up the radio. I can't say how long I held it in my hand, but I hesitated to call in what I had just seen. Who would believe me? Before this, I had heard of Bigfoot, but thought it wasn't anywhere close to being in the eastern states. I thought it lived in Northern California or Washington. I finally called it in, and I'd left the woman's house and that I had seen a man in the field, but I deliberately left out that I had seen it run in front of me and thought it wasn't a man at all. I went back to the office, finally realizing that I had to do my report, and again conveniently left out the bit of information. I know I was being self-serving, but who would believe me? I needed this job. I truly feared that if I told the sheriff I had seen a Bigfoot, that he would have sent me to get a psych eval. Something I couldn't afford to get. I'd always wanted to be in law enforcement. And if I told them what I had seen, I would have kissed this job goodbye. I never saw it again, nor did the woman ever call again. I don't know where it went or if it was just passing through. Since I had heard from a couple of guys who worked at the Department of Natural Resources that they had seen some odd things like what I had seen, and I did share my encounter with others I trusted, but I have never openly told my story to anyone. It's been close to 30 years now. All I can say is that I can still see the raw fear in the woman's eyes when she opened that door. And I can still see that massive thing sprinting across the road in my head. What she thought was a person wasn't that at all. It was a Bigfoot, and I still today wonder why it was taunting her. I'll never know, but I do cringe when I think back to when I was walking around in the fog around her house, that it was probably feet away staring at me. That gives me the goosebumps just thinking about it. Today's final encounter. It was January of 2011, and a group of 4 hikers were climbing the rocks in the southern part of Colorado. The group of friends had spent much of the day climbing and enjoying each other's company, and were reluctant to head back to the car when the sun started to fall. At last, they decided that they had enough of their adventure, and the group headed back to the car. Ray Dormer, the only survivor of the incident, told police what he believed attacked them that night. Ray states that the group had parked about 2 miles away from where they were climbing, and though they had intended to leave for the car earlier in the day, they'd been having a good time and ended up losing track of time. He stated that the sky started to turn orange with the setting sun, and they knew they needed to hurry to get back to the car. But the terrain was difficult to walk through, and in spite of them all being avid and experienced hikers, the progress was slow. They tried to keep moving quickly, but the rocks would randomly slide down the slope in front of them, slowing them down. They weren't too worried about losing the light, as each of them had a lamp on their hats, but Ray states that he had a funny feeling that something bad was going to happen. They came to a section on the trail that was largely hidden by shadows from the tall rocks on the other side of the hill. So each one turned on their headlamps, and they continued. But that's when it happened. Out of nowhere, this massive creature, close to 8 feet tall, jumped out at them from behind one of the boulders. Ray said the creature took them all by surprise. No one knew how to react. It leapt like a dog, but when it landed, it was hunched over, as though a person had bent down as they were trying to run. It had long, sinewy arms and curved back legs, but its hair only grew in patches on its body. It had a massive head with a broad snout. That reminded Ray of a bear, though he said that its ears were more like a wolf or a coyote. It had long claws on the end of its hands, if they could be called hands. It had partially formed fingers that looked like paws, only much longer. Ray stated that the creature was snarling and snapping at them, and in the confusion they panicked. He states that they all began running the trail as fast as they could, trying to reach the car, but the sound of the creature showed them that it might be right behind them. Ray said that he heard one of his friends scream, and he knew that it must have gotten them, but he was too terrified to turn around or even look and see what happened. He states that he knew he should have stopped, and that he should try to help them, but fear had taken over, and hardly remembers what he was doing. He reported to the police that he continued to run, and as he did, he could hear the sound of both of his friends running, and the creature behind them. He would hear another scream, but again, in his terror, he was too afraid to stop and help. Ray states that he ran all the way down to his car, tripping and falling twice in the process, and convinced that any moment he too would be grabbed by this horrible creature. He states he doesn't know what happened to his third friend, just that the two of them were running side by side one moment, then he was alone. At the car, he called out to all his friends, but he didn't hear any kind of reply, no shouts, screams, just silence. Feeling terrified once more, he stated that he jumped in the car and drove into town. He reported what happened to the police, who immediately sent out officers. Although the officers scoured the area, they were unable to find the beast who had haunted Ray and his friends. They walked up the trail to where his friends were last seen, but they were unable to locate the remains of one of them. Ray's friend had been torn apart, clearly slashed open, and something that was very long and sharp. As with the other reported werewolf attacks, his friend had puncture marks on his neck, but the puncture marks were far too apart for it to have been inflicted by a regular wolf or coyote. In spite of the extensive search, his two other friends were never found. And through the investigation ensued, the final conclusion was that they were attacked by a bear. But Ray knows what he saw, and he is convinced that the creature who attacked them was a dogman. Well, there you have it. There is another cover-up right there. One which you will not find in the newspaper. You will find a couple reports of hikers killed by a bear, but nothing with Ray's name in it. And I'm assuming that so people do not say homicide, and so it can just be quietly swept under the rug, which we all know happens constantly. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed today's upload, and thanks for all your support. Have a great day.